Hi y'all, we're back in the new year and we're going to be talking about plants over the next several videos. It's cold here, it's wet here, and over the next week we're going to get into negative temperatures, which we've not had where I live, negative temperatures in a couple years now. And I'm kind of concerned about all of the things I planted, but they had plenty of time to get settled in over the past 3+ months since I planted them. Everything's hardy here. So we should be good. Zone 6 where I live can get to negative 10 degrees. But today, Margot, which I think you've met Margot before, and I are going to be telling you about the perennials I have ordered and we're going to be planting in the garden this year. Now this isn't all encompassing. This is a broad group of perennials that some of them I've grown before. I think most of them actually I've grown before. So you'll notice a lot of them, and I'm adding them immediately to this garden because they're some of my favorites. Before we jump into that, I wanted to mention that if you've not picked up an heirloom rose catalog, you can go to 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲.com and pick up a catalog. I'm going to be doing a dedicated video on the roses that I'm adding to my garden later this month, and then tell you how I'm going to use them and why I picked them. If you're antsy and you just want to order something from Heirloom Rose in the meantime, I am an Heirloom Rose ambassador this year, and you can get 20% off all year long by using the coupon code Southern24. That is not an affiliate code, or I don't get commissions on that code, but it's just for my viewers and myself to use to get 20% all year long. So if you get a hankering for a rose any time of the year, you can order from 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲.com with that discount code. Now I'm going to pop up on the screen something I've been working on to show you how kind of this design is going to work over the next season. And my design process may be a little differently from yours. A lot of people hand draw things onto pieces of paper. I really love to use, because I have a photo background, Photoshop, and so it's a little more sophisticated than a lot of people may be able to use, but Photoshop works really well for me, and I can grab the pictures of the plants offline, basically remove the background from them and slap them into the image as I see fit. I'm a very visual person. I need to see the space laid out so I can know how to design well in that space. And it also allows me to see what pairings of plants I want to do to contrast color, contrast blooms, to contrast texture, to contrast foliage. And so that's my method. I have sent the drone up, or you can just take a picture from the side and design front to back. I like to take the drone up a little bit and get a kind of a level like this down 45 degrees or so to the space. Now designing this way can be a little difficult because it stretches and compresses the space. So in the background, the space is compressed, so it's kind of more difficult design in the back. In the foreground, it's a little stretched, and so what you put there may not be the exact number of things you'll need. So you'll notice in the picture on the screen that I have taken this photo. I think I took it in November after I finished the edge on the bed, and then I kind of photoshopped in the extra curve that I want to add to the front of the bed. I took all of the trees that I had planted, pulled images offline, removed the backgrounds, and stuck them in to where they will be this coming season. Now, because all of this stuff is in here in perfect bloom, all of this stuff obviously is not going to look like this all the time. But it's a really dramatic way to see all of your colors at once that'll be in the garden. So you can see my Crimson Century Maple there with that beautiful red foliage that lasts all year round and actually held onto its leaves to December here and still had that burgundy color until it got really cold. And under that, I've paired with some 1 in a Million coneflowers for that nice contrast. So this type of design allows me to see those colors of the blooms and the foliage and to contrast them really nicely so there'll be interest. Some cases not necessarily year-round, but the evergreens here, we've got some evergreens, including some Fire Chief Arborvitae that are kind of orangey now in the winter. The Star Power Juniper, which is a little blue. And then, of course, the interest of the upright trees that I have in that space, like Kindred Spirit and Crimson Century. So even when all the leaves are off of those trees, they're still very striking to look at. Now that you've seen this, this is mostly perennials. I'll go over some shrubs that I'll be adding in a later video. Haven't completely worked that out yet, and that might be something I have to wait until more closer to spring after I get the perennials in. They'll arrive late April. I can get those in the ground after our last frost. And then I can pick some shrubs that I want to add in the space. There is a list of shrubs I've been adding to that, some from my prior garden. After I did the last garden tour and I edited that video recently, I was like, oh, I need to add these back to the garden because I love those. So there'll be some things going up here. And this space is going to be the primary focus for this year. In a coming video, I'm going to talk about, one, the cut flower space and the goals for this property this coming year. I have a lot of lofty goals this year, but I find that I typically have lots of goals and I run through them pretty quickly. I just churn through things, and even though it seems like a lot to accomplish, I'm usually pretty good at getting it done because I spend a lot of time outside during the spring and fall getting plants and beds established. So let's just jump right into the perennials, and the first one I want to go over is Fun and Games Red Rover Hukcarella. So if you've been watching my channel very long, you know that I love Hukcarella. I've grown Hukcarella all the different colors. I wanted to do a Hukcarella river with all the different foliage colors 2 years ago. I started that project. I planted them from tiny plants and it didn't go very well, and they weren't all proven winners variety Hukcarellas. Now, Hukcarella is a cross between a Hukcarella and a Tiarella, which means, and oftentimes they're really vigorous and really productive. And this one specifically I grew from tiny plants, and it just became massive. Hukcarella oftentimes also can only take part sun to shade location. Red Rover for me will take full sun in our Zone 6 Southwest Ohio, and it is incredibly vigorous. I love the stark contrast of the leaves, that red burgundy color, and in the fall it's really pretty. When all the leaves start falling, it kind of just looks like fallen leaves. I used it to underplant a hedge of bobo hydrangeas, and I've tucked it here and there. So if you'll go back to the picture that I showed you of the design, I've kind of contrasted it with some more green foliage just tucked in the bed everywhere. So I'll be getting these in and I'll be poking them anywhere I can that I just need a stark contrast. Hukcarellas in general, since they are a hybrid, are pretty vigorous. I want to repeat the Hukcarella river in this front garden bed. I don't know that that's something I'll get to this year. It may be something I tackle next year, depending on what I can get my hands on. And I may find a lot of those locally and be able to mix and match some beautiful colors. And Red Rover specifically is hardy in zones 4 through 9. So almost anywhere in the United States you can grow this. And it gets 6 to 8 inches tall and 18 to 20 inches wide, and I have found that to be very true. It's very vigorous and gets very big very quickly. Now let's move on to our next perennial. None of these are in any particular order, but I'm going to be growing some phlox this year, one called Luminary Opalescence. I grew this one in the last garden and I really loved the way it looked. But I'm going to be growing quite a bit of these. Some of them in the front flower bed that I just showed you, and some of them I'm going to be putting into the cut flower garden to perennialize to be beautiful in cut flower arrangements for years and years to come. This is a tall phlox, so it can get roughly 2 feet and 6 inches tall to 2 foot 8 is what Walter's Garden says, and spread between 2 foot and 2.5 foot wide. Hardy in zones 3 through 8, so also a really broad scope of the United States there. A lot of these perennials can be grown probably in my location and also your location, really broad range, and that just means they'll hold up really long in your garden. The next perennial is a phlox, but it's a hybrid phlox that stays a little shorter that I grew in my last garden called Opening Act Pinka Do. Now how I grew this one in the last garden was really interesting. I tuck them all right next to each other, and even when these things are not in bloom, I like the foliage because it's really delicate and it kind of blows in the wind. But I had these in a part shade location under the willow at the last house. Bunnies kind of love to nest in them in early spring and fall, so regularly I'd see like kind of a spot of them that had been, a bunny had been nesting in, but it bloomed constantly throughout the entire season. Now the description of these say they're hardy in zones 4 through 8. Really great broad range of hardiness, 22 to 26 inches tall and 2.5 to 3 foot wide. These do spread, and they spread not super vigorously, but it's something that you'll have to deal with eventually of thinning those, just like any perennial, and moving them around in your garden. But it's certainly not something to not plant these for. They're not super vigorous that they're just going to take over your garden or anything. Mine were in that space for several years, and they just kind of creep like any other little perennial from year to year, get a couple inches wider and a couple inches wider, and then eventually you dig it up, transplant it, and you have new fresh plants elsewhere in your garden. Now the next plant is a coneflower, and I'm not adding a whole lot of coneflowers to my garden this year. I love coneflowers, but I find that if you leave the seed heads on, which are really great for birds, but those seed heads drop, most likely you're going to get a reverted coneflower that sometimes will often transition back to the purple. So this coneflower is one in a melon, and what I really like about it is it has huge, massive blooms, and I've showed these off, I think, on both Instagram and in my recent garden tour. They're massive. They're this big around at least, and they would be really great in cut flower arrangements as well. Great seed heads for the birds at the end of the season, but I also found these just bloom kind of prolifically all season long. And they come out pretty much a little more orangey, and then they kind of fade to a lighter yellow. And they're hardy in zones 4 through 8 and get roughly to less than 2.5 foot tall, 18 to 20 inches wide. So they are a little bit of a taller coneflower, which is a really nice mid-of-the-border plant. And if you're looking at adding any coneflowers to your garden this year, this is certainly one that I would highly recommend you look at getting. The next is one of my favorite 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲s that I added to the front garden beds last year at the last house when I was redesigning those spaces. And that is Darkside of the Moon 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲. Beautiful dark foliage for an 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲 compared with these really bright plum, purpley pink looking blooms in spring. And I can tell you, as long as we were at the last house last year to the end of July, they did perfectly fine in a full sun location. So these are an 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲 that can take full sun. They may need a little bit more water, but in my garden they did pretty well in that full sun location all year. 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲 of course bloom in the spring, but the seed heads are nice to use in arrangements then or for dried arrangements later in the fall, and they provide interest year round if you leave the seed heads to the next spring. The next plant on the list is Serendipity Alium. Now this is an improvement on Millennium Allium that's probably pretty common and may even be in your garden. I had both at the last garden, but I really like Serendipity because the foliage is a little bluer than Millennium, so it looks less like a chive and more interesting, and then it has the very nice small kind of delicate this size purple blooms on them throughout the season, and then they dry. They can be interest over winter, and they're really rabbit and deer resistant because they are oniony. Now they don't have an oniony smell just sitting around in your garden, but if you run your hands through it or crush the foliage, you'll notice that oniony smell. But I really love them. I've used them as a border. I've used them all sorts of places because they're just really nice to tuck in interesting foliage even when they're not in bloom. But when they do come in bloom, that perfectly little light, delicate purple color is really nice just anywhere in your garden. They're also super hardy, zones 4 through 8, and they get roughly 15 inches to 20 inches high and 15 inches wide. So these are things that will clump out over time. You can divide later after they grow out. Now let's talk about yarrows, because yarrows are really interesting plants. I'm going to be adding some to the cut flower space. Now I didn't have the best results with yarrow at the last house. They like really kind of, I'll just call it dull soil, potentially dry soil with not a whole lot of nutrition. And at the last house we had really kind of heavy clay, which made the yarrows kind of difficult to grow, but when they are blooming they're really pretty. At this new house the soil's much better, so I think I'll have a much better result there. And the ones I'm adding to my garden are Peach Sky, which I grew in the last garden. Really beautiful peachy color, perfect to add in cut flower arrangements for a perennial. Gets roughly 3 foot tall. It can be a taller perennial for you. I never saw that it got that tall in my last garden, so that may be over time it gets that tall. And roughly 2.5 foot wide, hardy in zones 3 through 8. So also a really broad range of hardiness. The next one that I'm going to be adding is Peter Cottontail Yarrow, which I also had in the last garden. I love to use this one as a baby's breath alternative in cut flower arrangements, and that's why I'm primarily growing it this year, is to add to the cut flower garden, but I'll also be adding it to the front flower bed, probably too. This one can creep and crawl a little more quickly than a lot of the other improved Yaros, like the one I just mentioned, Peach Sky. So it's something you need to be a little more careful of planting, just so it doesn't kind of take over a space. Not super incredibly vigorous, but just something to be aware of, to watch out for if you find it. But instead of having like the top little flower heads like you'll see a lot of Yaros have, this one has tiny little flowers all over it that look, like I mentioned, bigger baby breaths blooms. And so you can cut those and add those to arrangements, and I've done that before. Really just beautiful cut flower, and just something different in the garden that people will ask you questions about, and you can just tell them it's a Yarrow. It gets roughly 2 foot tall, 2.5 foot wide, hardy in zones 3 through 8. So also a really broad range of hardiness, and you'll see that picture on the screen there. Really kind of lovely perennial. I'm going to be growing a couple varieties of catmint. One I've grown before called 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 because it stays relatively small and it's easy to tuck in locations and get that beautiful minty smell if you run your hands through it, but also the nice purple blooms throughout the season. Some catmints can get really big and floppy. 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 tends to stay pretty small, so you don't have that issue. And I find that I have blooms on it year round in Zone 6, Southwest Ohio. A lot of catmints you can cut back halfway through the summer and they'll rebloom again, but the calyxes or the calyces on these plants seem to be a little darker. So even when they're necessarily out of bloom, they still look really nice, but I didn't find myself cutting them back midsummer, which is why I like that variety. They get roughly 14 inches tall and 20 inches wide, and they're hardy in zones 3 through 6. So another one of those good ones that you can probably grow. The next one is called Chartreuse on the Loose, and this is one that's recent to the market, I believe, but it's cool because it has yellow chartreuse foliage with purple blooms. So there's a really striking contrast there that I'm excited to add this one along with other perennials, because there's not a ton of perennials that you get that chartreusey leaf on. A lot of them are just the green leaf ones, maybe a little blue here and there. So a really interesting variety, similar to the Drops of Jupiter ornamental oregano that Proven Winners carries. It stays relatively small or short, less than a foot tall, 8 to 10 inches, and then 20 to 24 inches wide. So it kind of spreads out a little further and is shorter in height. And it is hardy in zones 3 through 8 as well, same as 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲. And it will just provide a proliferation of flowers for you along with the contrast of color. The next thing we can cover is sedums. I'm going to be adding a couple sedums initially to my garden. 2 that I've grown before, Back in Black, which I really love, really striking contrast for a perennial against all your other perennials because it has that really dark black foliage, purpley foliage, and then it comes out with these mahogany-ish pink blooms in later summer. Gets roughly 2 foot tall and 2.5 potentially foot wide, and I find it grows really well for a sedum, even in our kind of heavier clay soil that we had at the last garden. And we have some sedums here at this new home, and they are growing prolifically. I think one of them's Autumn Joy. There's another one there that I'm not sure. It's a very similar one, looking one to Autumn Joy. And these also do really well in cut flower arrangements. So I'm going to be digging up some of the Autumn Joy in spring and transplanting it into my cut flower space so those can get developed over time. They last really long in cut flower arrangements because they are succulent. So even you can use the foliage in the spring before the blooms come out. They also work really good in dried arrangements. But Black in Black I'm going to be combining with Boogie Woogie, which I grew in the last garden, and it's a ground cover sedum. So we have a planter outside at the end of the driveway. I don't have water out there yet, although that is a goal to get water to that container sometime this year, hopefully. But sedum, I want to fill that big container with Boogie Woogie sedum on the bottom and Back in Black that'll stand up. And it'll be just excellent yellow, dark purple, black contrast of foliage that'll be really striking, and a pop of color out to the driveway where I'm not going to be able to get water to very often or very quickly. Boogie Woogie is a ground cover. It does get up to a half foot tall. I found that it was just a few inches tall in my garden, and then it does spread because it's a spreading sedum, 16 to 18 inches wide. So over time it'll just get a little bigger. You can take little sections of it and pop it elsewhere in your garden after a few years. And the next variety of perennials I'm growing on my list are Veronicas, also called Speedwell, Spike Speedwell. It's the common name. And I've grown Veronica previously in the prior garden several years ago, and it just did not perform well, but it was a no-name variety. So this year I'm trying some Proven Winners variety. The first one's called Wizard of Oz, which has really, really beautiful blue, purple blooms that are really big. It gets roughly 16 inches high, so it's a shorter one, and roughly 2 foot wide, 18 inches to 22 inches, and it's hardy in zones 4 through 8. So a smaller zone of hardiness, but that still covers most of the United States. The Magic Show Veronicas from Proven Winners are supposed to bloom really well and for a really long time. The next one I'm growing, which I already added a few of these to the garden this fall, is Ever After. So Magic Show Ever After, and this is supposed to be the longest blooming Veronica in Proven Winners line. And it has a slightly lighter color, lavenderish, and really long bloom panicles. So these are nice to add to your garden for those spiky blooms, similar to a salvia. And this one gets roughly 16 inches tall and 16 to 20 inches wide, hardy in zones 4 through 8. And I'm really excited to grow these in the garden because I've never grown them before. They'll pair nicely with a lot of the other perennials I have. And you can see these in the original image I put on the screen, popped here and there in groupings of 4 or 5. And these were also really good to add to cut flower arrangements. So I'll be adding some to the cut flower garden. You'll find in the video that I'll be doing on the cut flower garden that I'm going to be adding a lot of perennials this year to that to become established for future years of cut flowers. The next perennial is a salvia called Violet Profusion. It is a very striking purple salvia. I also wanted pink profusion, so I'll probably be finding that locally, but I've got Violet Profusion on order. Gets roughly 16 inches tall, 16 to 20 inches wide, hardy in zones 3 through 8, so a really broad range of hardiness. And the Profusion salvias are known for their reblooming capability, which is really great. I grew Perfect Profusion in the last garden, and I did find that it rebloomed really well compared to other salvias I had grown in my garden before. So you just give it a little bit of a cutback after its initial flush of blooms, and it will continue producing blooms for you later in the season. The next one is a lavender, and you know I love lavender. I had a lavender hedge at the last garden. I'll probably repeat that sometime at this garden somewhere, but for now I'm going to do a short grouping of them along the sidewalk. In the last garden I grew Hidcoat, which I find to be a really great lavender. It's pretty short. It came back reliably year after year for me. I'm going to be trying out Sweet Romance from the Proven Winners collection this year and see how it does. Sweet Romance is a little more different than Hidcoat, similar sizing, but the actual blooms are a little fluffier on them. So it gets roughly 16 inches tall and wide, and is hardy in zones 5 through 9. So higher in hardiness because lavender tends to like the heat and kind of like Mediterranean climates, but it is good for us in Ohio, zone 5 through 6. The last garden I found lavender grew pretty well even in my clay soil. I did kind of put some sand underneath it when I planted it for some drainage, but it was on drip irrigation along with the rest of my perennials and was never any worse off for having that extra water. I'm going to be growing a lungwort, which is not the best name of a plant. These are also called pulmonarias. I grew them at the last garden. I really love them. They're a shade perennial that has really interesting speckled foliage and blooms really early in the spring. So when your hellebores are blooming, you will find that your lungwort is blooming probably before the hellebores go out of bloom. So you can put these in a shady location in your garden, which is where I'm kind of be establishing some shade beds under some of these older trees that I have this year. So I may keep these around and let them grow on a little bit and establish a little more, and then plant them into the shade beds when I get those done. They can take part shade to shade, so I'll probably be tucking some in the front flower bed that I'm developing as well, under some of the trees that'll eventually grow up. I think if I can give these enough drip irrigation, they'll be fine because that bed is eastern facing. So they'll get, sun until, after lunch in a lot of those locations. So if I put it up closer to the house where some of my Japanese maples are, I think they'll grow on really nicely, and then we can add some later to the shadier beds around the house. And the last one on my list today is a Dianthus called Classic Coral, and I grew this one at the last house, and I just love that perfect corally color. This year's color of the year is Peach Fuzz, I think, by Pantone. So Classic Coral will kind of breach that color kind of nicely, kind of be very similar to the Peach Fuzz color of the year. And so you'll see that I'll be adding a lot of those colors because that peach corally color is like my favorite anyway, ranging from yellow to pink, and then you throw in some purples. That's where I live in the garden, basically. So Classic Coral Dianthus is a taller dianthus. It's not necessarily a ground cover dianthus. It gets roughly 10 inches tall and 12 to 14 inches wide, hardy in zones 4 through 9, and I have found it to be really beautiful. The foliage is great even when it's not in blooming because it's one of those perennials that have a little bluer foliage. After it blooms, you kind of trim it back a little bit and it'll continue producing blooms for you later in the season like most perennials do. Well, Margot has been taking a nap. Margot, do you want to say bye? Come here. Come here. You want to tell them bye? Yeah, okay. Say, she is a lazy Springer Spaniel, but I love her. Thank you guys for joining me today, and check out the next video in the coming weeks. There's a lot to cover. It is still really cold here, so we can't get out in the garden, but spring's only a few months away, and there's a lot to be done between now and then with planning and preparation. Thanks for joining me, guys, and remember, be a light. Take care. Bye.